Hello, and welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Ragon Duffy. I'm here with my co-host, Kelly Gerner. And today we are back with part 2 of our discussion with Andrea McKenzie. We learned so much from her, so we are going to go ahead and pick up where we left off from last episode. If you have not listened to part 1, just go ahead and do that right now before you listen to this episode. Just stop right here and go find part 1 and then come back to us later.
You won't be sorry. It's a fabulous conversation. So before we pick up the second half of it, though, just a quick reminder that if you're not already hanging out with us over on Instagram, please do come find us at kindredspirits.bookclub. So that's where we typically share episode updates, all of our favorite little bookish memes, and the occasional glimpses of our L.M. Montgomery collections. And while you're at it, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever it is you listen. Help us spread the word. You leaving a review is really the best way to let other Ella Montgomery fans know that we're here. And one other great way you can support our show is by shopping the books we recommend at our bookshop.org link. You actually get to support both our podcast and indie bookstores, so that is a win-win. And now, back to our discussion with Andrea McKenzie.
Well, I want to go back. Let's talk a little bit about what the college experience would have been like for Nan and Di and Faith, because it's very different. And obviously we don't see a lot, but we have Anne's college experience as this direct comparison where in Anne of the Island, Patty's Place is idyllic. Who doesn't want to experience college life like Patty's Place? Hanging out with your friends by the fire and going to dances and, having all these cozy times with your friends. Like, yes, you're studying, but you're also having a great time experiencing this kind of step into independence. And that is not the kind of college that Nan and Di got, although I'm sure they did have social experiences.
I think what is also so particularly interesting about Nan and Di's college experience is that the Red Cross work and their work in service of the war loomed so large that it carried on year round. So they might be home on school break and they're still running back up to Kingsport because they have obligations with the local Red Cross up there. Rilla says that she barely sees her sisters during their school breaks because they're so busy. So this really was the sort of like all-encompassing, overarching theme of their collegiate experience.
Yes, university at the time would have been quite different. And we know that Faith at least had been there for a year or two, whereas it looks like Nan and Di, they're fresh at university. First of all, as we know, there were hardly any men left.
Right.
So the only men left there probably would have been the professors, the 16 and 17-year-olds who'd made it into university, and those passed as medically unfit.
And there weren't that many women enrolled still at this time, correct? So I'm thinking like class sizes must have been, in the single digits.
Yes, when Montgomery went to college, when she went to Dalhousie in Halifax in the 1890s, I believe there were 300 students, I think, and 30 of those were women.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the 1890s. So by the time she wrote the book, colleges had opened up even more. More women were getting educations, but it would have been a very deserted campus because only the women were left. I don't know how many of them there would have been. And as far as socializing went, all that time that Anne and Philippa, I did love Patty's Place. All that time that Anne and Philippa and their friends spent socializing and leading a very balanced life between spending time studying and having social times like dances. Nan and Di wouldn't have had that. Their time when they weren't studying probably would have been filled up with work, Red Cross work. That's not to say they didn't also socialize and have good times. They would have had to, because no one can live life for 4.5 years under that level of stress, doing that amount of work without having some kind of socializing activities. So the women probably started clubs. They probably went to movies together. They would have enjoyed planning and organizing such things as concerts because we know that Rilla enjoyed it. But at the same time, dances, if they enjoyed music, they probably joined choirs. They probably went to listen to music. They probably attended a lot of concerts. But dances, they wouldn't have been held in college, though it does occur to me that with that many young soldiers in town and at the training camps, it's always possible that they were invited to chaperoned dances with the soldiers. That is quite possible.
It must be a little different dancing with soldiers who are about to head off to war than just other college students. The stakes are so high and so different. Dancing with young men before they head off to war so that they have a lovely time before they ship out is vastly different than everybody just having a good old time at a dance and flirting and being silly and all of that, being pretty just to be pretty.
Mm-hmm. And also knowing that you would see those people the next morning, at least until you graduated. But Rilla thinks of Nan and Di's work as so much more romantic than her own. But my own sense is that it would have been heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It would have been enjoyable in some senses, especially if you are in a training camp and you're helping young men. At the same time, you would come to the realization that the young men are going overseas, and some of them won't be coming back, which is in itself heartbreaking. They know because Nan and Di, they have brothers overseas. Nan has Jerry overseas. Who knows? We're never told if Di has a sweetheart overseas or not. But because, going back to something Kelly said earlier, because they experienced that individually with their own brothers and their own friends, there is that experience of recognizing that all of these young men are also under threat.
Right.
So it may be seen by Rilla as romantic, and there will be aspects that Nan and Di probably enjoyed, but at the same time, they're saying goodbye to each group of men who go through.
And so many of them either won't come back, and the ones that do are coming back markedly different.
Yes.
It makes me think a little bit about how different the college experience was for all of those young students during COVID. If we go back to our parallels for COVID, of all of these students who are so excited to go to college and have independence and to have all of these fun experiences, football games and dances and clubs,
or even just the dorm room shenanigans, right? Staying up all night talking to your new friends in the hallway, walking together to the dining hall on a Saturday morning after you've been out all the previous night, at a party, like all of these like typical college experiences. And that wasn't what they had at all, unfortunately.
No, they got this isolated Zoom class experience. My nephew started college during COVID and he got to go to class. The class was broken up and you went into in-person class like every other class so that the class was manageably small. And the other class you did on Zoom. So that way nobody sat next to each other. They sat all spread out throughout the classroom. So nobody sat next to each other. It was just him and his roommate in their dorm room. They didn't get a chance to do so much of the other fun stuff because socializing now came with this potential for really high consequences of catching or spreading COVID. And we didn't know so much then. And what a loss that innocent experience was for those students and for Nan and Di that they didn't get a chance to have that kind of carefree college experience.
Yes. I'm also thinking in parallel with that of the fourth year class, the graduates during that first year of COVID, because lockdown happened for us here in Toronto in March and classes finished in April and they were supposed to have convocation in June. Oh. And of course, none of that happened. So all those last weeks of school when they're supposed to be sharing great experiences to wind up their university education. They didn't get any of that. We held a virtual graduation for them, for the students from our department who were graduating. They seemed so grateful for that experience because it meant they got to see one another again, even if it was only virtually.
That was the weird thing with COVID, right? That so many of those, you don't even think about all of those experiences, like how meaningful they are until
Yes,
they're not even an option.
exactly. These kinds of experiences do mark us. I mean, the memories may soften somewhat, but those kinds of experiences that are missed, I think, stay with us. Hopefully,
Yeah.
they make us enjoy even more the good experiences that we have and the community, the collective events that we share.
It's profound in this shared experience way, right? It's not light and fun necessarily, um, which I'm sure is what Anne had hoped her daughters would get a chance to experience, but it's profound in its own way.
Yes, and we have to remember too that Nan and Di spent their entire 4 years of
Yep.
university at a college that was at war.
Yep.
And so it isn't just Rilla who goes through that profound experience of maturing. Presumably, Nan and Di go through much the same thing and lose that lightheartedness.
Yeah.
Hopefully, they will regain a deeper kind of joy once the war is over, but we simply don't know.
I think that's a great segue to a quote that I'm going to return us back to. And this is when Di asks to be allowed to join the VAD, and Anne has a moment to reflect on what she would have wanted for her girls. The Blythe family has received a telegram letting them know that Jerry Meredith was seriously wounded at Vimy Ridge, shot in the back, the telegram said. Quote, "Poor Nan," said Mrs. Blythe when the news came. She thought of her own happy girlhood at Old Green Gables. There had been no tragedy like this in it. How the girls of today had to suffer. When Nan came home from Redmond 2 weeks later, her face showed what those weeks had meant to her. John Meredith, too, seemed to have grown old suddenly in them. Faith did not come home. She was on her way across the Atlantic as a VAD. Di had tried to wring from her father consent to her going also, but had been told that for her mother's sake it could not be given. So Di, after a flying visit home, went back to her Red Cross work in Kingsport.
That specific quotation, I think the beginning of it really shows the toll that war had on women, the grief they suffered. It also shows the inequity between the genders when it came to war. The Blythes already had 2 sons overseas, and Di is asking permission to go to England, and her father refuses her on the grounds of her mother's health.
He didn't do that when Shirley wanted to join up.
No, he didn't. He left it up to Anne, but in this case, he didn't. I think it is largely forgotten these days that Canada sent myriad nurses and volunteers overseas, and such women were always at risk. Even if you were in England, there were still Zeppelin raids happening, especially in London. And if you were a nursing sister with the Canadian Army and you were stationed in France or Lemnos, well, France especially, by 1918, there were air raids almost every night of the Canadian hospitals in France. So women were at risk, and women did die during the war. The families of those nurses and those other women went through stress on their daughters' accounts as well as their sons, but they still let their daughters go. Dr. Blythe Gilbert doesn't do that. In fact, he doesn't, as you point out, even ask Anne what her decision is. So there is inequity there. I can understand why Gilbert would want to spare Anne the stress of having yet another family member going overseas to the war with the perils of the voyage to start with, and then the dangers over there. But I do think that the Reverend Meredith and his wife are much more equitable. They enabled their daughter to go overseas, as well as their sons.
Although part of me, this just flashes me back a little bit to when we talked about Rainbow Valley, I had quite the rant about Mr. Meredith's parenting and lack thereof. So part of me also wonders whether to a certain degree, he doesn't get a say over what Faith does because she had to raise herself for so long. And you kind of, this is just, it's making me think when my parents got divorced, I was 15. This is not in the same league of what Mr. Meredith did. And my sister was 12. We lived with my dad. And my dad, he, especially my sister, when I went to college and it was just him and her, he kind of was very hands off, and she went to lots of parties. She turned out fine. She was not irresponsible, but he kind of checked out of like actively parenting her. Yeah. And then at some point he wanted to check back into parenting her right before she went to college. And she was like, it is too late on that one to set a curfew, my man. No, thank you. So I wonder a little bit whether it was so much as Mr. Meredith allowing Faith to go as Faith having been kind of fully functioning without her dad's input for quite a while. I mean, maybe.
Also, Faith is just a force of nature.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, this is the girl who stood in front of the congregation. She is fearless. Yeah. Of course she is going to do this dangerous, difficult work. It's not enough for her to stay at home. It couldn't be.
But I think it does point out that Di, who at this point would have been 21 at least, probably 21 at least at the time that she is wanting to go across at the VAD, is not considered to a certain degree old enough to make that decision for herself. But when Shirley turns 18, he is.
Exactly. I think Faith is independent, and I think it is entirely possible that having grown to the age of 12 or 13, before her father marries again, that she is fully independent and remains that way. Mm-hmm. It's also just her character and personality. She is full of courage and she's full of force. Whereas Di doesn't come across the same way. Not the way that Gilbert puts it, in fact, is you can't go because of the impact it would have on your mother. So there's a guilt factor there. If you do this, it may harm your mother, as though the trauma of having two sons and then a third overseas is not already harmful. Yeah. It's the lack of consultation of Anne, because she should have had a say in this. She would understand, and she would probably be honest with her daughter.
Yeah.
So I really don't know, but I do see that as one of the inequities.
Yeah, Gilbert's being a little paternalistic to Anne and making this decision on her behalf. And what we've seen from Anne and her parenting thus far is no matter how she may have felt about it, if her child had really felt a strong conviction about doing this, she would have wanted them to do that, because that's what she did with her sons. And there is no indication that she wouldn't have done that if Di had felt very, very strongly about going.
That's what she did with her sons, and that's what she did with Rilla, right? Mm-hmm. I think Anne's parenting is a little bit more egalitarian in the moments where Rilla says, these things are important to me. Now, granted, often in the matters of things like green velvet hats. So, slightly different stakes there. But the same thing, she says, okay, you do you. This is important to you. This is a matter of personal conviction for you. I'm going to make space for you to do that. So I think, Andrea, this is such an amazing thought exercise. What would Anne have said to Di had Di been allowed to ask her mother for permission to go?
I think Anne probably would have measured Di's needing to go, in the sense of would have talked to her about why she wanted to go, why it would take being in England as a VAD instead of doing the same work in Canada, because she could have. I think she would have listened to her daughter carefully. They would have talked it through and then come to a decision, probably mutually. But in all probability, Anne being Anne, in the case of each of her sons, she did let them go. Shirley is only 18, so he did need his parents' permission. But as you say, Diana is 21. So is Faith. Diana is not financially independent, and VAD work did not pay very much at all. But at the same time, it's interesting to speculate what Anne would have done, I think, given that she did not want any of her sons to go, and yet she managed to send them off. I think she would have done the same for her daughters.
Yeah, she felt like it wasn't her place to stand in the way of what they thought was right.
Yes.
She hasn't given us any indication that she would view that differently. And maybe Gilbert intervenes because he knows that Anne would have allowed her to go if Di had brought that conversation directly to Anne. And maybe he's, in his way, he's looking out for her. But again, it's a little paternalistic towards Anne and smacks of all this gender inequity that they didn't seem quite as concerned about Shirley. But to be honest, nobody's quite that concerned about Shirley except Susan.
Yeah, Shirley doesn't appear in the books very much at all.
No, that is a question for, you know what? I want to ask all Ella Montgomery experts, what is the deal with Shirley? Why did we write him at all?
Because what is the point of him?
What is the point of Shirley?
Why did he get so little time on the page?
I will give you my opinion.
Yes.
Right now. Yes. So in Rilla of Ingleside, Shirley plays the essential role of ensuring that Susan also has a mothering role in the book. Keep in mind, Anne is a mother. Anne is a mother by birth. Rilla becomes a mother through unofficial adoption of Jim's. Susan is also considered Shirley's mother. Remember, when he says goodbye to mother Susan.
Yeah.
So this gives Susan that extra dimension. Even though she is a spinster, she is feisty and spunky and voices the war so well, including criticism of the way it's run.
Mm-hmm.
This shows a softer side to Susan, and it sanctifies her in the sense of mothers in the war in Montgomery are sanctified if their sons are overseas.
Oh, I like that.
Andrea, that's absolutely,
that's brilliant.
That is the take that we needed. Oh, okay. All makes sense now, of course.
Because this idea of sanctifying motherhood, right? Like we had some thoughts about Rilla, like why we had to make Rilla love Jim's, like why that had to be, like from a feminist point of view, why that had to be specifically part of her growth arc.
Why she had to like become the Virgin Mary in Ken's eyes, like what, this whole interesting.
Right. And why then, if this makes it like Susan is not only, but Susan's value is made more valuable by the fact that she is Shirley's mother. Interesting.
Yes. It gives her that complexity of emotion.
Right. Well, and then all of a sudden it takes her from somebody who had been wholeheartedly supporting the war. And now when it's Shirley going, what does that do?
Susan thinks that flying is a clean job and that at least Shirley won't be in those dirty trenches. The life expectancy of a pilot at that point in the war, once he was trained and he was overseas, his life expectancy was 6 weeks.
From enlistment to
not from enlistment, but from like arriving.
They arrive overseas and they start flying sorties over the battlefields. Their life expectancy was 6 weeks.
Stop it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's hoping he spent a good long time in training.
I hope nobody told Susan that.
Yeah. Wow.
So at the denouement of the novel, when the war is finally over and life in Glen St. Mary is starting to return to normal or finding this new normal, just as our lives had to readjust and recalibrate to a new normal after COVID, Rilla gives us this little epilogue for her siblings and friends about how kind of life is starting to go on somehow, even though it feels like it maybe should be impossible. Quote, Jem is going back to college in the fall, and so are Jerry and Carl. I suppose Shirley will too. He expects to be home in July. Nan and Di will go on teaching. Faith doesn't expect to be home before September. I suppose she will teach then too, for she and Jem can't be married until he gets through his course in medicine. Una Meredith has decided, I think, to take a course in household science at Kingsport. And Gertrude is to be married to her major and is frankly happy about it. Shamelessly happy, she says. but I think her attitude is very beautiful. They are all talking of their plans and hopes more soberly than they used to long ago, but still with interest and a determination to carry on and make good in spite of lost years. We're in a new world, Jem says, and we've got to make it a better one than the old. That isn't done yet, though some folks seem to think it ought to be. The job isn't finished. It isn't really begun. The old world is destroyed, and we must build up the new one. It will be the task of years. I've seen enough of war to realize that we've got to make a world where wars can't happen. We've given Prussianism its mortal wound, but it isn't dead yet, and it isn't confined to Germany either. It isn't enough to drive out the old spirit. We've got to bring in the new. So as we talk kind of about the war ending, we've got both like the practical piece, what are people going to do next? And then we've got this moral and ethical piece of how do we reckon with this war and what does it mean for us moving forward?
So let's start with the practical first. One of the things I notice in that quote is the very limited perspective of work for women. So Nan and Di have been doing all this Red Cross work well beyond knitting and sewing, probably organizational work and fundraising. All that would have honed their skills in the same way that Rilla is now quite an organizer herself. And then there's Faith, who has quite a bit of nursing experience now. She's been in England for at least 2 years. She won't be home till September 1919. And so her skills in that area will have been well established. But listen to the list that Rilla gives. The women are going to go back and teach, all of them except for Una, who's going to go off to household science. Mm-hmm. When I look at these women and I look at what Canadian women overall were doing, Montgomery wrote about what she knew. She left out much of women's work, such as working in munitions factories. When men left, women entered banks and other businesses to take over from the men. In fact, the scope of work was widened. Unfortunately, when the men came back, they wanted their jobs back, and for the most part, women were expected to return to the home. So like Gertrude, many of the women went on to get married, raise families, but all of the charitable work that they had done, many of them used the skills they had developed during the war to continue that kind of work. Rilla doesn't mention Mary Vance, but I can't imagine Mary Vance sitting around letting her husband do all the work. They're going to be running a store, going into partnership probably. She will become phenomenally successful. I speculate she will spearhead their marriage into a business partnership and that they will end up wealthy. When I think about Faith and all of those nursing skills, here is where I think Montgomery is somewhat limited. Most of the VADs, the untrained nurses, did not take up nursing training. However, Faith is one of those people. Her husband is going to become a doctor. He's got 3 years of medical studies to do, I believe. Faith is one of those people. She's not going to be content just to come back to Canada and teach. I could speculate for her that she would enter nurse training, and when her husband finishes medical school, she would also be very valuable because she has the skills to actually help him in his life work, and he will have the skills to help her. So you can see the more equitable partnership there. I also cannot imagine Rilla, despite everything that's been written about her regressing because she says yes at the end instead of yes. I cannot imagine her merely sinking into domesticity. She hasn't been ambitious. She doesn't want an education. Her dearest wish is to become Kenneth Ford's wife. But all this organizational ability, she's going to keep that and she's going to carry it on. And I have to say that all those women who formed those local Red Cross chapters, the Red Cross chapters themselves may have closed down, but such things as the Women's Institutes, which were fairly new at the time, and other social community building groups continued to exist. So I can see not just charitable work, there won't be any more war hospitals and so on and so forth, fundraising with goals of village improvement or community improvement, all those kinds of things. These women will continue that work just as much as the trained nurses, the military nurses who went overseas. Many of them came back, about 50% of them married. They formed their own voluntary Veterans Association to both socialize and help them deal with what they experienced during the war, and also to help them with peacetime, adjusting to peace. But they also raised funds, they organized events, they used all the skills. They weren't allowed to continue nursing after they were married, not in hospitals. They continued to use all the skills that they had built during the war on behalf of the community. Now, in the larger sense, the impact of war. Those who lost men during the war, men or women, that is, brothers and sisters, daughters and sons, or parents, their lives were, as Rilla's was, forever changed. You don't suffer such a loss or grief. It also impacts the ways that we remember war and memorialize it. Montgomery's Rilla of Ingleside helped to shape Canada's cultural memories of wartime in the sense of it was published in 1921. Canada's memory of the war is very different from, say, the UK's because of the war poetry by people like Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, the books written by Roger Graves, and so on and so forth. The First World War in the UK is remembered officially as useless slaughter. But the war in Canada, Montgomery mentions the Battle of Vimy Ridge in Rilla of Ingleside. At that battle, the 4 divisions of Canadian soldiers fought together for the first time. And the news about their victory at Vimy Ridge went at amazing speed right across Canada. The war did unify Canada in ways that it had not been before. A young country, suddenly with the goal of victory in mind, came together not just through battles, but through women's associations, such as those local Red Cross associations, because they were spread across the country and because they got news of what one another were doing for the war effort. So the impact of war and the impact of Montgomery herself is to remember the war as creating the nation of Canada. And the loss was great. 400,000 men went overseas. 60,000 did not return. Many others were wounded. Most were traumatized. So there was an impact on family life, on individuals, but also on the larger nation. Yet, in part, because of Montgomery, we remember what came out of the war, and that is the sacrifice of these men for this cause created a nation. So it's a kinder memory of war, and yet Montgomery outlines and depicts so vividly the sacrifices made not simply by the men who went overseas and lost their lives, but of the women and the families who lost them and who worked for victory.
That was amazing. And I think that
was
is
amazing. Perfect.
kind of the perfect note to wind up this section, and we'll just move into like our inspired by section, because we could not add anything. That is just a really fascinating look into what both this book means for Canada and what the war meant for Canada, because of course that's not an experience that we are as familiar with from our own history. So that's been just invaluable. Well, let me ask this question. Do you think that Ella Montgomery always felt that way about World War I, or how did that start to change for her?
So the comment or the words of her journal are reflected in Rilla of Ingleside. On Armistice Day, Ella Montgomery was in Prince Edward Island helping her beloved cousin Frida look after family who were down with the flu. On Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, Montgomery asked what has been born of the sacrifice that had been made during the war. And we can see that reflected in Jem's words in that quotation you read, that the sacrifice must result in some great benefit, not for us who fought the war, but for the coming generations. However, Montgomery's journal in the 1930s documents her horror at the rise of Hitler. And then, of course, when the Second World War was inevitable, she was horrified. Her sons were then of an age to go and fight, and she was afraid that that would happen. And she thought of the slaughter of the First World War. It was not the war to end all wars, as she had expected. There had not been something new born that would cause war to stop. And so that last book that Ben Lefebvre edited, The Blythes Are Quoted, that shows Montgomery's very changed attitude towards the war. Mm-hmm. She no longer thought of it as necessarily justified. It was sheer horror. But that was the First World War as seen from the lens of the middle of the Second.
Yeah.
Andrea, if there's something I could ask you to return us back to, it would be how the book Rilla of Ingleside very specifically impacted Canadian identity around World War I. I think we're wondering, how did Rilla impact Canadians' view of World War I? Or how did it maybe not even impact, how did it define?
That's a question that's difficult to answer because we would have to go back to that time. Now, my argument is that Rilla of Ingleside did indeed shape Canadians' cultural memories of the war. At the same time, I also recognize that Rilla of Ingleside, think of the plethora of books that have been written about World War I, many of them by Canadians. Rilla of Ingleside is one of the few, possibly the only, war book written in the immediate post-war era in English in Canada to still be in print today. It has been in print pretty continuously ever since 1921 as part of the Anne series. When we think about that, we think Rilla and the Anne series are now seen as women's books, but they weren't necessarily at the time. But they did present a very strong women's perspective about the war. Reviewers at the time thought that it accurately reflected what Canadian communities went through during the war. And that was right after Rilla was published. In the ensuing decades, keep in mind that the male war story came to dominate and be considered really the only legitimate war story. Women's perspectives were lost. So women were, as Montgomery shows us, considered active war workers alongside and with men. And that connection between the women in Canada and the men overseas was maintained through all those letters and packages. There was more about connection than about separation in such things. But those ensuing decades when male war stories were considered the only legitimate ones, and there was Montgomery still appealing to generation after generation of readers, of scholars. And if you look at the people who have written about the First World War, it really is remarkable how many Montgomery scholars have done so.
Yeah.
So really, because there's Ben Lefebvre, Laura Robinson, Jonathan Vance, Sarah Glassford, they've all written about Montgomery and then gone on to write about the First World War. So it's difficult to tell the impact, but it is also a factor that Montgomery's view is the accepted view, really, or at least it was up until English literature scholars decided that we had to emulate the UK. And so in the 1970s and 80s, the only legitimate Canadian war stories became by authors like Timothy Findlay, who wrote The Wars and wrote about it in the British sense of mass slaughter. So sorry, I don't know if I've answered your question. I've tried to do so honestly. Montgomery has been there. She's still not necessarily acknowledged when war writers are named by, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and institutions like that. She has been there and with us all the time since the First World War and consistently read. And look at the number of people who read Montgomery and then think about the number of people who have absorbed her version of war.
Yeah. And think about, as we were discussing at the beginning of our conversation, how this book, particularly the Anne series, and through the Anne series, this book has impacted even a global understanding of World War I and what that was like. When you think about the global reach of the Anne series and the fact that, people from around the world are reading all of these books, the version of World War I that they are learning, especially in countries that don't teach World War I the same way they would teach it in Canada or in England, is Montgomery's.
Yes, which is woman-centered. It involves men and it involves community, but we get women's perspectives.
Well, that is the perfect place to kind of wrap up. And Andrea, we like to end our episodes by being inspired by Anne, or Rilla of Ingleside in this case, and recommend something. Sometimes we recommend things that are only tenuously related to our episode. Sometimes we recommend things that are bang on. So if you have any recommendations for our listeners, we would love one. So Kelly, what are you inspired by today?
Today, I am inspired by really the main topic of our conversation, the Red Cross. As we've been hearing all about today, this is a venerable organization that has been responding to war, conflicts, and other international crises for over 140 years. And I will freely admit that I heard lots of criticism of the Red Cross and their work over the years. And until very recently, I don't think I truly understood the work that they were doing. One thing I used to hear about the Red Cross is that in the aftermath of a crisis, all these generous people would go and donate to the Red Cross, and they would do that instead of donating to local boots on the ground organizations. And so all that money that was so generously given would end up going to Red Cross administration instead of directly to people in need. And look, I don't know, maybe that is just part of the story of how a large international relief charity operates, but I can tell you all from lived experience that the Red Cross is very skilled at getting money in the hands of people who need it quickly, and that they have the mechanisms and the staff to do it in ways that oftentimes those local boots on the ground community organizations just don't. So after those fires early last year, the Red Cross was in fact the only charitable organization that was able to provide my family with meaningful financial assistance within the first few weeks after the fire. And I mean, they called us the third weekend. They called us, they found us, and they said, "Do you need money?" And we said, "Yes, our house just burned down, please." And they got it to us that day. It hit my bank account the same day they called us. So our experience with the Red Cross has been powerfully positive. They are a large international organization. They know what they are doing. And the Red Cross is now a part of our charitable giving as a family. So I would encourage all the kindred spirits to consider a gift to the Red Cross as well.
That is a great idea. I agree. And I'd add to that if you want to give directly to people impacted by crises, contributing to individual folks' GoFundMes is also an excellent way to help, because so many times people just need to have the flexibility to make the choices that are best for them in the moment. And often straight up cash is just the best way to help.
I think Andrea said so in the episode, right? Cash, yeah. All the fundraising they were doing throughout Rilla of Ingleside is because sometimes you just need money to get things done.
Yep. But my own recommendation is going to be a little out of left field in terms of relating to this episode. But when I think of Faith and Jem and World War I kind of was getting an emotional connection to this book and its sequel. It's Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross and its sequel, Ruthless Vows. This is not a direct link, but these two books are kind of a fantasy analog to our world, in which that war in the book parallels World War I, and the author has said was inspired by World War I, including gas attacks. But it's fought on the behalf of gods. So look, go with me here. But there's an amazing rivals to lovers arc between rival journalists. There's magic typewriters. There's a commentary on wartime journalism and propaganda, sharp, thrilling twists that make you want to pick up the sequel the instant you finish the book. You guys, unlike me, will not have to wait. In fact, I read the first one on a girls' reading weekend with Kelly, in which one day I sat on the couch and just read this book straight through. I think Kelly brought me snacks. I don't think I even got up. Yeah. I think I just spent 4 hours straight through just reading this book.
I had read it first and I gave it to you and I was like, "Ragon, this is very precisely your thing."
And it was, and she was right. So it's an excellent read anyway. But thinking about the young women of Rilla of Ingleside, this book is a great parallel because there's so many women journalists and nurses and clandestine spies happening in this book. And it's kind of an interesting fantasy take on World War I.
You can absolutely read those books as sort of like an alternate universe Gem and Faith fanfic. Gosh, I want Gem and Faith's House of Dreams. I love what Andrea was saying about predicting that Faith goes to nursing school and sort of becomes his like helpmeet in his practice. I can totally see that. Fanfic authors, again, I'm sending up the bat signal. I do need that book. And I would love to see how the two of them sort of navigate this end of wartime together.
So, Andrea, do you have any recommendations for us?
Well, the only thing I can really think of is not books, but it's a reminder of the strongest theme in Rilla and also the reason we started the readathon, and that is community. So I would recommend, especially at the time of year when in many parts of the world the snow is falling and people may be feeling a bit isolated, to think of one small thing you can do to create community and do it. And it could be something like leaving a comment on someone's Facebook page or a podcast. It could be sending a card to someone. It could be making a visit. It could be anything that your imagination considers that would help to create community.
We love that.
I think that's a powerful and important recommendation at any time of year, Andrea. Thank you.
Well, the reason I thought of it is because I belong to a pop choir. So we sing Pat Benatar and such.
Stop it. That's so cool.
You don't have to audition, you just attend. And we had our final concert yesterday. We had so much fun doing it, but they recorded it. We sound terrible.
Oh, I'm sure you don't.
We had lots of guests. My husband came along and he said, no, you were fabulous. You were great. But I watched the recording today. We were awful, but you can also see us in the back row having so much fun. And Toronto can be a very lonely place. And this choir is one place where people make friends. We have a good time. We know each other's names. We know we'll see each other once a week.
I love that so much. And you don't necessarily know this, but Kelly is an amazing singer. So choirs and being part of like a musical community is so cool.
There's something about breathing in the same cadences as everyone else in the room that connects you to them on, I think, a level that maybe we don't really understand fully. And, whatever you sound like is irrelevant because you are all having that collective experience together. So I think that's really cool.
Shortly after the fire, right, Kelly, we went to, I don't know if you've heard of this, it's called the One Day Choir. And they're mostly based in New York, but they're starting to pop up in other cities. And it's exactly what it sounds like, where you just go and no experience necessary. And a whole group of strangers comes together and learns one piece of music together over 4 hours. And we took my daughter as well. And it was Defying Gravity.
Defying Gravity from Wicked.
Oh.
And it was
a beautiful arrangement, beautiful 4-part harmony arrangement. So like no one vocal part got all the like fun runs and trills. And yeah, there's just something about standing in a big room with people, even perfect strangers, and singing with them. And it makes you feel connected in a way that I would, for my money, few other things are as effective as doing. Yeah. Andrea, if you see one of those one day choirs around Toronto, you've got to go. It's something else.
Okay.
All right, dear kindred spirits, that is our episode for today. Andrea, oh my goodness, thank you so much for joining us. What a privilege to sit with you today, to get all of your expertise and insight and context for this book. I think you've given us all a much more thorough and broad understanding of this text and the real lived experiences of the women and girls who lived through World War I in Canada. If our listeners want to know more about you or join a conversation like this one, where is the best place for them to find you?
The readathon, although I'm no longer creating new posts, I'm sharing other people's posts. You can find more information about Rilla of Ingleside there. I would also recommend the edition that Benjamin Lefebvre and I edited of Rilla of Ingleside. It's the Penguin version, if you can find it, because it's got the glossary in the back. Ben did all the literary allusions. I did all the war terms and war notes. What I would add, by the way, is recommendation to all the people out there. I will be recommending this podcast to everyone I know. I think it's great what Ragon and Kelly are doing, and I hope you'll invite all of your friends, all you listeners out there, invite all of your friends to come and listen.
Oh my gosh, Andrea, thank you for doing our work for us today. As Andrea says, the best way to support the show is to share us with a friend, a coworker, your mom, your book club, anyone who you know who could use a little more Anne, a little more Ella Montgomery in their life. Also, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating or review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. And because we love to spoil those of you who stay all the way to the end, if you do any of that, send us a screenshot or let us know, and we'll send a thank you note and one of our gorgeous sage green KSBC stickers with Anne's face in profile. They are so pretty, gives you forever bragging rights. You can also support the podcast by shopping through our bookshop.org link, which is in show notes. We do earn a small commission, and you get great books from independent bookstores. And of course, be sure to follow us on Instagram at kindredspirits.bookclub for all the behind-the-scenes bookish fun. Kindred Spirits, we adore you. Andrea, we adore you. And we will see you again in 2 weeks for more delightful conversations about Rilla of Ingleside.
Thanks for listening, Kindred Spirits.